and we want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. I want to say a very special welcome to Central Keller ISD. Excuse me. Teachers, if you're watching, if you're not signed up, please go to www.tiny.cc/high-school-restoration. Sign up for us, please. The program today will be Aquatic Ecology. During this virtual field trip, students will identify the interdependence of organisms in the aquatic environment and the biosphere. Students will identify how energy flows and matter cycles through the aquatic environment. Students will also explore the factors affecting aquatic population cycles. Mr. Dominguez will tell you about producers, consumers, and their decomposers. Freshwater food webs will be discussed by Mr. Monroe. Saltwater food webs by Ms. Schramm, and factors affecting aquatic populations by Ms. Ramirez. Students, during this program, you cannot ask us a verbal question, but you can go to www.tiny.cc/question-answer and fill in a question and send it to us, and we will do our best to answer them during the program. If not, I'll send the answers to your teachers. They can discuss them with you. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Mr. Dominguez is going to tell you about producers, consumers, and decomposers.
Hey guys, in this portion of your virtual field trip, we are going to be talking about producers, consumers, and decomposers. And here we have some of my favorite decomposers. These guys are isopods, and they are more commonly known as roly-polies. And roly-polies can both inhabit terrestrial and aquatic environments, but like any other decomposer, they play an incredibly important part in processing or eating all the decaying matter that is constantly building up in their environments. And these guys are not your typical everyday roly-polies. These guys are the Cubaris species that look like rubber duckies. Can you guys see that? They are really adorable, and I've been keeping these guys forever. They're really awesome. But anyway, in this portion of your virtual field trip, we are going to be taking a little tour of our environmental center to showcase some of the aquatic animals that are producers, consumers, and of course, decomposers. And I know these guys are not aquatic, but they are really awesome and worth taking a look at. Look at that guy go. All right, guys, let's get started. All right, guys, before I show you some organisms, let's review. Producers, consumers, and decomposers, what are they? So a producer is an autotrophic organism capable of producing complex organic compounds from simple inorganic molecules through the process of photosynthesis using light energy or through chemosynthesis using chemical energy. So basically, a producer is an organism that is able to create its own food. And they are the very base or the first link in a food chain, and they're incredibly important to consumers. So a consumer is a living creature that eats organisms from a different population. A consumer is a heterotroph. So a heterotroph is an organism that derives its nutritional requirements from complex organic substances. So a consumer is just an organism that eats other organisms. And finally, we have the decomposer, and the decomposer is the final link in the food chain. They break down dead animals and plants and return vital nutrients to the soil or whatever environment that they are living in. So some decomposers, like fungi, can be seen without a microscope, but much of the decomposition process is carried out by microscopic bacteria. So I'm outside my classroom, guys, because I wanted to show you guys some primary producers. If you look a little bit deeper into this, it's called a stock tank. If you look deep into the stock tank, you'll see some algae, and algae, like their terrestrial plant relatives, are primary producers. So they provide food for the fish that are living in this stock tank. These fish were actually rescued from the pond that dried up earlier this year. So you can see some algae at the top as well. but there's definitely a ton growing at the very bottom. So this is where the pond used to be. So as you can see, it is now teeming with terrestrial plant life, and like the algae that I just showed you, these guys are primary producers. So as you can see, there's a ton of grass that provides food for other organisms. So these are some of my favorite consumers that we have here at the center. We find them in our lakes and at our pond. These are guppies. These are a type of fish. They are pretty tiny, so we use them to feed other fish. They consume the algae that I showed you guys earlier, but we use them as feeder fish for, like I said, some of the bigger fish that we have. We have a snapping turtle that I'll show you guys in a minute or two. And we also have a semi-aquatic ribbon snake that feeds on these fish. But these guys are awesome, and you guys can actually ask your teacher to order them from our Living Material Center. And you guys can keep these if you'd like. They are an awesome example of a consumer that you guys can find in aquatic environments. Here we have one of my favorite consumers. It's a red-eared slider. So these guys are native to the central US and northern Mexico. They are omnivores, so that means that they eat both plant material and other living organisms. They are pretty awesome. So they'll eat the guppies that I just showed you guys earlier, but we mostly feed them worms and crickets and roaches. These guys are pretty adorable, and you can tell that they're well suited to live in aquatic environments just by looking at their feet. So look at that webbing and those claws. They are pretty awesome animals. This has to be one of my favorite animals here at the center, and definitely one of my favorite freshwater consumers. This is a common snapping turtle, and just like the slider I just showed you guys a few moments ago, they have webbed feet and are omnivores. So this guy is pretty big. He's a few years old, and we feed him lots of worms, lots of roaches, lots of crickets. So, and he lives with some fish. He doesn't eat these fish, but they eat his leftovers, so they clean up after him. So he is definitely one of my favorite animals here at the center, one of my favorite consumers. So hopefully you guys get to enjoy him pretty soon. He is pretty awesome, and he's got an incredibly strong bite force. On average, these turtles have about 209 newtons of bite force. And lastly, I just wanted to show you guys a picture of some fungi, some decomposers that I found near a body of water at the Post Oak Preserve. And remember, guys, fungi, isopods, they all play an important role in breaking down the dead material that is constantly building up in their environment. So I hope you guys had a good time just looking at some of the creatures that we have here at the center. Remember that they all are part of a food chain, and if a part of the food chain is broken, then all the other parts will follow. So I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. I'll see you guys next time.
Thank you, Mr. Dominguez. A question came in. What are 4 examples of decomposers? Examples of decomposers include bacteria, fungi, some insects, and snails, which means they're not always microscopic. Fungi, such as the winter fungus, eat dead tree trunks. Decomposers can break down dead things, but they also feast on decaying flesh while it's still on a living organism. Okay. Mr. Monroe is going to tell you all about freshwater food webs next.
Okay, good afternoon, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be discussing and kind of looking at freshwater food webs. Now, you heard Mr. Dominguez describe a lot of the animals that we do have that have lived in our aquatic systems out here, the ponds, the lakes. I'm going to be showing you a few more as they relate to the food webs that at this time once existed in our ponds. Okay, now I've got a short presentation of a PowerPoint that I'm going to start off with, and then I'm going to cut it short so that I can show you some of the other survivors from the ponds that are now completely dry. So bear with me while I share my screen with you. Food chains and food webs. Now, a lot of what you're about to see probably will not have a lot of information about an aquatic food chain or food web, but I want you to get that concept of what a food chain and a food web really is. A food chain is a sequence of organisms, each of which uses the next, the lower member of the sequence, as a food source. It's the way that energy moves through a particular ecosystem. In a food chain, each organism obtains energy from one at the level below. Plants are called producers. You heard Mr. Dominguez discuss that. And I'm here to tell you, I'm here lately about the only true producer that we have had in our ponds is something that is really durable, really tough, and sometimes can be overabundant, and that's green algae. And you know, they produce their own food through a process called photosynthesis. Of course, you guys know that. Now, the animals that exist or that live in our aquatic systems out here, they are referred to as consumers because they have to eat other things, right? Cannot manufacture their own food. Primary producers. Now, just like I said, and Mr. Dominguez said, algae is the primary producer that we've had out here. It goes through that photosynthesis process using light energy, carbon dioxide, and it's already in water to go ahead and produce its own food in the form of a simple glucose. Now, here lately, just before our ponds went dry, I noticed that we were beginning to get another producer that was starting, and that is a producer called duckweed. Years ago, when I first started teaching out here, around the edge of the pond, we used to have cattails. But because of an overabundance of a little turtle that Mr. Dominguez showed you, the red ear slider, the cattails soon disappeared because he explained to you that a red ear slider is an omnivore and they just love to eat the roots of aquatic plants. Now, just to refresh your memory, herbivores are animals that eat only plants. Carnivores eat only other animals, and omnivores eat both. Detritivores, they are actually the decomposers. These are animals that eat dead materials and organic waste and breaks it down so that it can be recycled in the environment. Now, we do have trophic levels that exist in an ecosystem: primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. That snapping turtle that you saw in the image, he is actually a tertiary consumer that is in our pond. Now, at one time, we had an animal that was similar to this. We had beaver out here. But once the pond started going dry, the beavers moved off. They moved to the lake. We've also seen a variety of ducks, and we know that we've got grasshoppers. We've had a variety of snakes. We've got all kinds of birds that are flying around here. We also have some very healthy raccoons that hang around the ponds. And when the pond started going low, they were getting a field day out there. And then we have worms, which are very common. You know, all of this, all of these organisms fall together in food chains, which the best way that I can explain a food chain is the way I explained it to elementary kids or primary kids. A big fish will eat a little fish. A little fish will eat a smaller fish. That smaller fish might eat an insect that may have eaten a piece of plant. So that kind of explains what that food chain is. Now, when there's a lot of food chains that are interconnected, they're interlocking in a pattern of food chains, this becomes a food web. Now, I'm going to stop it right there, stop sharing, and I have a few animals that I want to share with you, and we're going to talk about that. Let's talk about the producer, the primary producer in our pond. Students, I have a little sample of this stuff. And there's a couple of things I want you to remember about producers and decomposers. This is that old green stuff that looks like green hair. It is called green algae. Now, green algae is pretty durable, and sometimes it can take over a body of fresh water. It was the primary producer in our pond. Now, it has some adaptations that allow it to survive in adverse conditions. This is one of the things I want you guys to remember because it's one of the questions of the day. You know, this algae has the ability to either free float or it can hold fast. And it's got structures that help it to hold itself down, or even gas-filled structures that allow it. These gas-filled structures are called floats that allow it to float and drift. In the stock tank behind my lab, the algae that you saw in Mr. Dominguez's picture is floating. But if you'd have looked a little closer, there is some that is attached to the bottom. So that's one adaptation that it does have, okay? One more thing that it has a reproductive strategy. It can reproduce either sexually or asexually. So that helps it keep going. And sometimes it can be over abundant and just take over a body of water. And then it causes some other problems. All right. Now, the other thing I want you guys to be able to do at the end of my session with you is to identify the primary freshwater decomposer. And of course, you heard Mr. Dominguez mention bacteria. Primary decomposer in our ponds, in the lake that's in the preserve, is bacteria. And guess what? It's got very special adaptations that help it survive. In fact, bacteria, like most prokaryotes, guess what? They have a cell wall, and that cell wall acts as a protecting structure that allows them to survive in hypertonic conditions. Earthworms are another decomposer that we find around the edge of our pond and sometimes even in the water. And to my surprise, I found out that earthworms can live several weeks in water. Their skin can absorb oxygen from the water. That's amazing to me. Now, as we move to the first, our primary consumers that have existed in our pond, there used to be a fish called a grass carp. This grass carp primarily consumed vegetation. So it would be considered to be a herbivore. And thinking about it, would there be animals in that pond or in that body of water that would consume that grass carp? Another name for the grass carp, they're often referred to as Asian carp. And sometimes when our ponds refill and new fish populations come in, we have an abundance of grass carp. Now, because they are herbivores, guess what? Other fish that love to eat other fish, they kind of home in on those grass carp because I call them a feeder fish, okay? And then we have smaller fish. There is such a variety of different kinds of fish that fit into that food web. Here I have a little one, and I don't know whether you guys can see it. This is a little blue sunfish. This little blue sunfish, he wouldn't last long in my aquarium back there with Snappy the snapping turtle, or even with my big mouth bass that I keep also to show students. In fact, let me show you the big mouth bass. This is considered to be the top predator fish, and this is not a big one, but look at the size of his mouth. Now, he definitely is going to eat another fish, and he probably doesn't even care. He's not going to be picky about what little smaller fish that he might eat. He will eat one of its own, so they could be cannibalistic. And if you ever get a chance, you ought to feel those little teeth. And that's why I wish you guys were here so you could do that. Feel those little teeth on the top part of his lip and the bottom part of his lip. Now, I've showed you a carnivore, and these guys, they're existing in the lake now because the lake has gone dry. But let me show you another animal that falls in place, or he has a place in the food web out there at the pond. And this guy, the type of consumer that he is, we haven't talked much about this type of consumer. He is an insectivore. His name is Hopper. So you guys know what I'm talking. This is Hoppy the bullfrog, and we know that he loves to eat bugs and insects. Do you think there's anything in the pond that might consume him? Sure enough, there is. So there's a variety of animals that, hey, the saying is, eat or be eaten. Now, Mr. Dominguez also showed you a red ear slider. He has his place in that food web out there also, okay? And he's actually an omnivore. And this is the most common aquatic turtle that we have in our region. Now, a lot of people see these, and a lot of times they'll say, oh, there goes the snapping turtle. But you know, that's not a snapping turtle, right? That's a little red ear slider. He is an omnivore. So he has his role in food web. And then I've got one more animal. Well, in fact, I've got one more animal to show you. And of course, you're going to get a close-up look at this guy. You saw Mr. Dominguez. He took a picture of a snapping turtle that is actually in a tank. Well, this guy I've had for 23 years. When I first collected him, he was about the size of my fist. Now he's big. He is one that would be considered a tertiary consumer in our pond. And they've been known, you heard Mr. Dominguez say that they're an omnivore. Well, very seldom have I been aware of them eating plant life. These guys love meat, or they love to eat another animal. They get so big in lakes and ponds, they will consume baby ducks. Let me get him out. This is Snappy the snapping turtle. Now, I estimate from the time that I collected him about 23 years ago, that this guy is probably about 25 years old. They can live to be 50 years old and weigh as much as 50 pounds. Now, the web feet that you heard Mr. Dominguez talk about, guess what? That is an adaptation that they have to help them survive in their environment. So that's Snappy the snapping turtle. And boy, is he ready to chomp on something, because I woke him up in the middle of his nap, okay? So I'm gonna put him back before he gets rambunctious. Well, I could probably show you a little bit more, but listen, guys, hopefully I've got you to the point where you'll be able to answer those two questions. Identify a freshwater producer, explain how it has an adaptation to help it survive. I've given you that information. And then identify a freshwater decomposer. I've talked about that and the adaptation that they have to help them survive. I want you guys to have a good day the rest of the day and enjoy the rest of your virtual field trip with us. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman in case some of you have a question you might want to ask. You guys have a good day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monroe. And I've been out here nearly as long as Mr. Monroe has, and I do remember Snappy when he was a little guy. He's getting fairly large now. We had a student that asked us to describe a freshwater food web. Creating a food chain allows a tidy web for our minds to think about an ecosystem. However, in reality, there isn't a single path of energy flow. Instead, we look at all the connections in the ecosystem. We end up with a figure that looks more like a spider web, which is why we refer to it as a food web. And now Ms. Schramm is going to tell us about a saltwater food web.
Hey everybody, it's Miss Shram, and we are talking all about marine food webs. So let me get this popped up. All right. So the marine food webs, we can break it down into similar groups as freshwater food webs. So we've got the different trophic levels. We've got level 1, the photoautotrophs or plants, then the herbivores on level 2, carnivores on level 3, and the top predators on level 4. So it's just the same as freshwater, but it just looks a little different because we're in the ocean now. So level 1, the photoautotrophs or the plants, these are the marine primary producers. So that includes phytoplankton, algae, kelp, and seaweed. So I'm going to kind of skip through the examples and show you big pictures of them because I don't have my aquarium here with me. So we are going to be looking at large photos of everything because I want you to be able to see it up close. So the first is phytoplankton. If you've ever seen SpongeBob, you know the little character Plankton. Well, these are what plankton look like. So they are tiny little plants and you have to use a microscope to see them. They are teensy, teensy, tiny. Then we have seaweed, which we all know. Red algae. And kelp. So you can see a little fish already in there in the kelp forest. So these are the primary producers. That's what everybody else relies on. Next, we have the herbivores. So these are the primary consumers, and they eat only the plants. So this includes zooplankton, mollusks, barnacles, fish, and jellyfish. And here we have a huge herbivore, a manatee, and the manatee is guzzling up all those little plants along the bottom. So here's a picture of zooplankton. It looks like phytoplankton, but a little more advanced. So the phytoplankton kind of look like little bacteria, and you can see the zooplankton are looking way more animal-like. Some of them look like teeny tiny shrimps. They look like little insects. Actually, I think maybe plankton was supposed to be this kind, zooplankton. I don't know how scientific SpongeBob is, but regardless, it is the type of plankton, but these are the animal planktons. Then we have mollusks. So mollusks are any of those creatures like snails, this nautilus, anybody that lives in a shell. And actually, octopus are considered part of the mollusk family, but they are cephalopods and it's a little different. So these types of mollusks are the primary consumers. They're little herbivores. Then we have fish that are herbivores too. So if you've seen the movie Finding Nemo or Finding Dory, the blue hippo tang is an herbivore. That's the blue one with the stripe. Then we have a yellow tang, which is actually, they're part of the surgeonfish family. And then up above the silly one that looks like he's smiling is a parrotfish. So all three of these types of fish and the fish that are related to them all eat algae. So the smaller two, so the tangs, they can be kept in saltwater aquariums at home. I guess technically if you had a big enough fish tank, the parrotfish could too, but those other two are small. And so a lot of times if you have a lot of algae in your tank, those fish will eat the algae for you. They eat the algae off the rocks, off the side of the glass. So they are our little herbivores. And the parrotfish would do the same, but they are really, really big. So you would not have them at home. Then we also have jellyfish. So jellyfish, they're kind of an interesting fish. They're like filter feeders. So they can sting their prey. So sometimes they eat like other zooplankton and stuff, but mostly they're herbivores. They also eat kelp. So that kelp forest I showed you earlier, jellyfish feed off of that kelp. All right, then we got level 3, our carnivores. So that includes some crustaceans, it kind of depends, larger fish, and then octopus, which I mentioned earlier, they are considered in the carnivore level. Then of course, in this picture, we have sea otters. They are eating that little crab. They also are omnivores. So even though they're in the level 3, they are also omnivores. So they eat that kelp as well. But they do eat the little crabs. All right, so crustaceans. Like I said, some crustaceans, not all crustaceans are in level 3. It just depends on the kind. So we've got certain crabs that eat algae, certain crabs that are decomposers, lobsters, shrimp, they're all in this category. Then we also have larger fish. So this is a picture of one of my favorite fish to keep in the aquarium. It is a lionfish. And this is actually a fuzzy dwarf lionfish, which is my favorite. They stay rather small. Their larger cousins, which are just regular lionfish or zebra lionfish, are extremely invasive. So a lot of times people that are in the aquarium hobby, like myself, if they get tired of these fish because they are big carnivores and they're predators in the tank, sometimes they dump them out into the ocean. And this is a really horrible idea because they are extremely invasive. So because people dumping them from home aquariums into natural environments, these fish are predators. And so they kind of flourish in the wild and become really invasive and kind of compete with other fish that belong in those environments. So it's always a good idea, saltwater or not, whatever kind of fish you have at home, keep it in your aquarium. Getting pets is a commitment, but releasing them into the wild can really wreak havoc on those natural environments. All right, but anywho, then we also have the little octopus. They eat little mollusks and smaller fish. All right, now we're to the big boys, the level 4 top predators. So these are the marine tertiary consumers. That includes killer whales, so orcas, sharks, dolphins, tuna, pelicans, seals, walrus, and humans. So of course, sharks, we know sharks eat fish. We have a lot of irrational fears about sharks, but sharks are apex predators and they will eat fish. And dolphins, they also eat the fish. And tuna are actually huge and they will eat smaller fish as well. And pelicans, I mean, look at that mouth. He could just scoop up all the fish he wants, and he is definitely a consumer. Then we've got seals, which they look chubby and lazy, but they will eat tons of fish. Walruses, same goes for them. And the biggest predator and the biggest consumer of the ocean is us humans. There's a picture of fishing boats. Our habits of overfishing really wreaks havoc on environments. We fish tuna way too much, and it kind of messes up the environment for the rest of the food web. All right, we're gonna go on a smaller, much smaller scale to talk about a little food web that I have created my own self. So this is my coral reef tank, and this is a picture back in the spring before we had that horrible annoying freeze that kind of caused a tank crash in my tank. But regardless, so the reef tank is a really delicate balance. It's a really fun hobby, but it can get kind of expensive and time consuming because you really have to understand how these food webs come into play when you're deciding what to put in your tank. So you can see I've got clownfish, I've got a purple and yellow fish that's called a royal grandma, and then in the front is a little pink and green fish, which is a 6-line wrasse. So they all serve a very important purpose, and they're all in a delicate balance. So let's see how it starts. So the reef tank food web begins, of course, with the phytoplankton, and that is my primary producer that I have in the tank. I can't even see it, but I know they're there because I see algae growing. I see sea sponges. The healthier your tank is, the more you'll start to see sea sponges developing. Different kinds of algae, some are beneficial, some not so much. But anywho, so who feeds on those? The first ones are copods. Copods are essential to any aquarium any saltwater aquarium, especially these little copods are what a lot of fish rely on. And if you don't have a good population of copods, then your tank will crash. So I was mentioning earlier that freeze caused my tank to crash. Well, when it got in cold weather, the reef tank that I had at my house wasn't able to be at like a natural temperature for a reef because it was in my home, which lost power. So a lot of the copods died off. So once the copods died off, slowly over time, even months and months later, my tiny home aquarium is still suffering the consequences of losing all those. But who I did have when it was running really healthy, who depended on those copods, was my mandarin goby. The mandarin fish is super beautiful and they eat almost solely copods. So they are my little consumers. Then also clownfish, who you saw in the picture, they rely on the copods. And then I have another shrimp, which is the coral banded shrimp. So this coral banded shrimp, he eats those copods, but he also will eat fish. So I have the mandarin goby, and there should be another line with the clownfish as well. But the coral banded shrimp, once he didn't have any copods, guess who he started going after? My fish. And so that delicate balance was a little tipped in his favor, and he started going after my fish. Then we have another producer. So this is the bubble algae. So I said some algae are beneficial and some are not so much. It kind of depends on what you want in your tank. Bubble algae, a lot of fish don't want to eat it, but urchins will, sea urchins will eat algae, and also emerald crabs. So not even all crabs. I remember I said crustaceans are sometimes in different categories. Emerald crabs are one of the best eaters of bubble algae. They're almost the only ones that really go after it. All those tang fish and like the dory fish, the hippo tangs, those do not eat bubble algae. They prefer green algae. And like I said, the coral banded shrimp, he'll take those out. He'll take out anybody that's left over. Once his copods are gone, he'll take out anybody and he'll be happy about it. So I wanted to show you a few specimens before my time is up, even though I think my time is up. But I wanted to show you really quickly. I have some barnacles. So these were once living things, and there used to be little critters reaching out, but this is just the external shell that's left over. I also have the shell of a sea urchin. And yes, all the little spikes you can see are gone, so that all decomposed, but the shell is what's left behind. I have some other mollusk shells and some starfish. My decomposers, I have a ton of teeny tiny starfish that decompose all the dead animals that are left in my tank. And then my last one's my big fat shark teeth. Okay, well, my time is up. I have to send you off. I hope you have fun, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Ms. Ram. Student asked a question. What is an example of a marine food web? Phytoplankton and algae form the basis of aquatic food webs. They are eaten by primary consumers like zooplankton, small fish, and crustaceans. Primary consumers are in turn eaten by fish, small sharks, corals, and baleen whales. Thank you again, Ms. Ram. And now Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you about factors affecting aquatic populations.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and y'all have already learned about the different plant and animal life within an aquatic ecosystem. So now we're going to learn about some factors that impact them. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you guys, and we'll get started. So let me start the screen share. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these two questions. The first is you should be able to identify and explain 2 factors affecting aquatic populations. And the second is you should be able to explain what acidification is and explain how does it impact aquatic populations. So keep those 2 questions in mind as we go through the video today. And to the right, you're just seeing a quick little video of the EEC ponds and our post oak hidden lake. So be thinking about what are some factors that might affect our local EEC aquatic ecosystems. And we're going to be discussing that later in our presentation. So on our next slide, the first factor we're going to talk about today are predators, invasive species, and competition. So on the left, you see carp, and I didn't realize this, but the common carp is actually an invasive species. Many people don't consider them invasive because they have been here since the 1870s, but they're not originally from here. They're originally from Europe. And we do have other species of carp that are also invasive that actually came from Asia. So one of the most particular ones that you've probably heard in the news recently was the invasive silver carp, which was in the news back in July, because they were actually found near Lake Texoma. And some of the reasons why people are concerned about the invasive silver carp is because they can be potentially dangerous because they can actually jump over 10 feet out of the air. So that can be a hazard to boaters and fishermen. But one of the ways that they impact other aquatic life is because they actually compete with other filter feeding fish, such as some of our natives like shad. So some of these invasives, they are increasing competition with our natives. And then also with our carp, they can uproot aquatic plants while they're foraging. They also eat other fish eggs. They also increase the turbidity in a body of water, and that's because carp will move rapidly and it will often kick up that sediment. So they can have a huge impact on an aquatic ecosystem. But of course, fishermen love the carp. They're good sport fish, and lots of people love to go after them. So that's the carp. Our next one are the zebra mussels, and they're actually from Europe and Asia, and they were introduced here in 1988 in the US. And back in 2009, they were actually found here in Texas. And they are a horrible invasive species because they will easily attach to boats and pipes and docks, and they can spread very easily because the larvae are actually invisible to the naked eye. So when they're like larva form, they are so tiny that most people don't even know that they might have them on their boat. And that is how they get carried from one body of water to the next. So that's why if you own a boat and you go boating at a state park or a state waterway, you're supposed to thoroughly clean your boat to make sure that you're not accidentally carrying some of these invasive species with you guys. So you can see the zebra mussels here have attached themselves to a native mussel that we have. So they can be very destructive. And they occur in clusters, and they have a very strong byssal thread that acts as a powerful anchor. So they can be hard to remove, which is why you really need to scrub your boats. This other one is water hyacinth. It is also an introduced species, and it was introduced here in about the 1800s. And as you can see, it's actually a pretty flower. It's a pretty aquatic plant. And one of the problems with this one is people brought it over and they like to have them in their ponds and lakes because it does look pretty. But the problem is it's not from around here. And so they can actually grow into super dense colonies that block out the sunlight, and it outcrowds our native vegetation. So they are actually considered a very aggressive grower, but they are pretty. We just don't like to have them around. And then the other one is giant salvinia. This one's also from South America. They are free floating and occur in clusters. And they can actually double in size in 4 to 10 days under good conditions. So they have a super fast growth rate. And they were first here in Texas in 1998. They were first noticed in Houston. And then since then, they've been found in Lake Athens, Lake Gilmer, and some other smaller lakes here in Texas. So these are some of our common invasives that we have. And again, they do outcompete our natives for food and resources. Some other factors that impact our aquatic ecosystems would be things like drought, floods, and eutrophication. So here's a quick little map from Drought Monitor, and you can see how areas of Texas are impacted by drought. So we are in Dallas. So I actually live right here in this little one. This is Henderson County. And if you go just 2 counties over, this is Dallas County. And Seagoville, where the environmental center is located in Dallas County. And you can see that parts of Dallas County are in the yellow, which is abnormally dry. And then you can see where I live in Henderson County, they are under a moderate drought, which I believe because I have very little water behind my house. So I do know that we are impacted by drought where I live. So drought obviously can impact our aquatic organisms because there's less water or no water at all. So here at the Environmental Center, you saw some video from Mr. Dominguez. You can see that without the water, a lot of our aquatic vegetation and animals die because they don't have the water. Some animals are lucky that they can relocate, like some of the turtles can find another water source. But again, drought does impact our animals and plants. Also floods, we might not think about floods too much, but floods can actually carry runoff. They can carry litter and pollution and carry it to other bodies of water, affecting those bodies of water, but it can also transport organisms. So one of the cool things is there's actually a nursery near the Environmental Center, and when we get heavy rains, runoff from their stock ponds actually flow over into some of our ponds, and that is how we get some of our fish. They kind of travel through the water runoff. So that's pretty interesting. And then the next process is eutrophication. I believe you also saw some examples of this as well. And the eutrophication is just when there's excess nitrogen and phosphorus in an aquatic organism, and it causes a huge algae bloom, which you see over here. And when there's too much algae, it will actually deplete the amount of oxygen available to other aquatic organisms, causing a mass die-off. So you can see here, we have some fish die, and that was due to hypoxic conditions, or essentially very low oxygen. And again, that can be due to runoff from nurseries and farms, all that excess fertilizer. Another factor would be things like pollution. So we know that pollution hurts aquatic organisms. They can accidentally ingest some of the pollution. They can get caught in trash. And then something interesting here, we have something that I found very interesting. This is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's a collection of marine debris in the North Pacific Ocean. So essentially it spans, as you can see from this little image, it spans from the West Coast all the way to the West Coast of North America, all the way to Japan. And so essentially debris, all the trash, is being carried by the subtropical convergence zone. So that's essentially where the warm water from the South Pacific is meeting the cooler water of the Arctic, and it's acting like a highway that's moving all of this trash around the ocean. So you can see our trash does indeed travel. So you might not think that your pollution is affecting another body of water, but it is. And it's estimated that about 70% of the debris here will actually sink to the bottom, and most of what you guys see here are microplastics. So eventually those bigger pieces of plastic will sort of break down into smaller little chunks, and that's what we call those microplastics. The heavier, denser stuff will sink down to the bottom. But again, think about how is that impacting our marine life that Ms. Schramm just talked about. And then our last one that I want to talk briefly about is acidification. And that is essentially when oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that carbon dioxide reacts with seawater to form carbonic acid. And due to increased carbon emissions, more carbon dioxide is actually entering our oceans. And this is creating additional carbonic acid in our waterways. And you can see in some of these images how that additional carbon dioxide is affecting our marine life. And it's actually degrading and dissolving those hard exoskeletons. So the more acidic the seawater becomes, the less calcium carbonate it can hold. And many of our marine species, like coral and these seashells, they need that calcium carbonate to build their protective shells and exoskeletons. And without that calcium carbonate, it actually makes their shells very weak and breakable, and they can erode like you see here. So our emissions do impact our aquatic and marine organisms. And then I do have a reflection question for you guys. So think about what factors are affecting your local aquatic ecosystems, and also think about what can you do to help your local aquatic ecosystem. So on the right, you're just seeing my local aquatic ecosystem. So I live near Cedar Creek Lake, and I have a channel behind my house. And I didn't litter, I didn't put that stuff there, but when we have heavy rains, all that trash and litter from other places eventually comes into my channel. We also have a huge problem with erosion. So sediment from the lot across from me kind of slides into the lake, and it kind of makes the channel more shallow. It also makes the water more turbid. And then another example is I take my dogs to the Gun Barrel City Park, and so last year, this pond used to have all sorts of aquatic vegetation in it and around it. And I thought it was a beautiful pond. It was a great, had great places for the ducks and the turtles and other animals to hide. And earlier this year, they actually bulldozed all that vegetation down, and now it looks rather bare and empty. So my question was, how does that impact the aquatic life around it? So now the ducks and turtles don't really have a shelter or a place to hide. And the reason they did that is because this is a very popular catch and release pond. And so they wanted to have more access to allow people to fish from the shores. And when there was all those tall cattails and vegetation, it was very hard for people to fish there. So that's why they kind of cleared it. And then I went over the weekend and I noticed that the water looks super weird. It kind of looked fake and artificial. And that is because they actually put a blue dye into the waterway. For one, it makes it look, I guess, prettier, more aesthetic. But also that blue dye, it makes the water darker. And so that darker water prevents sunlight from reaching the very bottom parts of the pond, and it prevents aquatic plants from growing. So they kind of did that, to stop plants from growing, so it's easier for people to fish there. But I personally did not like that fake blue look. So again, think about what are some factors that affect your local aquatic ecosystems. And I'm going to stop my screen share, and I think that's
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. Now I am going to share my screen. During this virtual field trip, students identify the interdependence of organisms in the aquatic environment and the biosphere. Students identify how energy flows, matter cycles through the aquatic environment. Students also explored the factors affecting aquatic population cycles. Thank you, teachers, for joining us. If you would, go to www.tiny.cc/HS feedback, fill out a short form, and send it back to us. We would appreciate it.